Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a figure who, well, really burst onto the global stage almost out of nowhere. Ibrahim Traoré.
Yeah, quite a trajectory.
I mean, in just a few months, he goes from being this relatively unknown army captain to becoming Africa's youngest head of state. It's just a dramatic shift for Burkina Faso, especially for a nation grappling with, a really severe security crisis and this complex political history.
It is, and understanding who he is, well, it means navigating quite a landscape of information, which is where your sources come in, right?
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to take this stack of articles, research, notes you've provided, and really pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge.
Kind of a shortcut.
Yeah, think of it as a shortcut to getting up to speed on this fascinating, sometimes quite controversial figure. We'll explore who Ibrahim Traoré actually is, where he came from, and how he managed to rise to power in this really challenging environment.
And what the sources reveal, it's a journey that starts in, well, the most humble settings imaginable, and then takes these really unexpected turns.
Right.
We'll trace his path, starting from a small rural village, then through his education, his military career fighting that intense jihadist insurgency, and ultimately, his controversial rise to the presidency.
So let's jump right into that beginning then. A place that feels, well, worlds away from presidential palaces.
That's Kara. It's a small rural village in Mahone province. And the sources, they really emphasize just how humble his beginnings were there.
So what does that mean, practically speaking?
Well, it meant growing up with direct exposure to the daily grind of poverty, limited infrastructure. Burkina Faso is one of the world's poorest nations, and these rural areas, they often lack even basic services.
But the research you shared also highlights the resilience of those communities. What else did your sources reveal about how those rural roots might have shaped him?
Well, for one, his upbringing was in a predominantly Muslim country. The sources suggest his faith likely instilled a strong sense of discipline, community values pretty early on.
Okay.
And Muham province is also ethnically diverse. You've got Bobo, Bwawa, Fulani groups there. That kind of environment, it could have fostered an ability to connect with diverse populations, which, is a skill that would definitely be valuable later in leadership.
And witnessing the economic hardships, firsthand subsistence farming, dependence on foreign aid.
Yeah.
I imagine that had a pretty significant impact.
Oh, absolutely. The sources strongly connect this to the development of his skepticism toward foreign influence later on. He saw the struggles, right, the dependence, and that tight-knit nature of rural communities where mutual support is just essential for survival. That probably fostered a deep sense of duty, collective responsibility, traits we definitely see pop up in his military career and leadership style.
Okay, so from Kara, the sources take us to his primary school in Bondoki. What was rural education like back then in the 90s in Burkina Faso, based on your material?
The sources describe it as often quite rudimentary. Schools were underfunded, resources were limited, and economic pressures meant dropout rates could be high.
Right.
What's striking, though, as the sources point out, is that despite all these challenges, Traoré apparently excelled academically. That really suggests an early determination, a discipline that kind of set him apart.
Those are definitely qualities you'd expect to see later. So from there, a pretty significant shift. High school in Bobo Dioulasso, the country's second largest city.
Yeah, that was a big transition. Moving to an urban center like that exposed him to a much more cosmopolitan environment, broader social dynamics, and importantly, the political undercurrents of a city known for its cultural life and history.
Your sources mentioned descriptions from his peers around this time. They called him quiet, but also very talented.
Yeah, that combination's fascinating, isn't it? It suggests maybe introspection alongside real capability. Bobo Dioulasso, it's a major commercial cultural hub. He would have been exposed to urban poverty, different ethnic groups, and also the lingering influence of French colonial legacies, things like French being the main language in education, key economic ties.
Okay.
The sources imply this exposure probably sharpened his awareness of Burkina Faso's dependence on foreign powers.
And it seems the sources link this period in Bobo Dioulasso directly to the start of his political awakening. This was when discontent was growing under President Blaise Compaoré.
Exactly. The Compaoré regime, which which, was heavily criticized for corruption and its really close ties to France, it faced frequent protests, especially in the cities.
Right.
The sources suggest this whole environment profoundly influenced his early political thinking and fostered that strong admiration for Thomas Sankara.
Ah, Sankara, the revolutionary leader.
Yeah, his vision of self-sufficiency, integrity, it resonated deeply with young Burkinabe back then, and honestly, it still does today.
Which brings us to university in Ouagadougou from about 2006 to 2009. He studied geology. Now, that might seem like an unusual path at first glance, but your sources quickly connect it to Burkina Faso's gold mining sector.
They do, and it's a really critical connection. Gold is, well, a cornerstone of the country's economy. Studying geology gave him this scientific mindset, emphasizing analysis, problem-solving, understanding natural resources.
Yeah.
The sources suggest this analytical approach is actually pretty evident in his later strategic decisions, especially his focus on resource-based reforms. Things like approving the construction of Burkina Faso's first gold refinery in 2023, or suspending gold export permits in 2024. It's like linking that scientific understanding directly to national economic strategy.
And Ouagadougou, being the capital, must have been a major hub for student activism and political talk, too.
Oh, yes, even more so than Bobo Dioulasso. It was alive with political debate. Lots of criticism of the Compaoré regime was bubbling up. The sources indicate Traoré's time here likely deepened his exposure to Pan-Africanist ideas.
That's the movement for African unity and solidarity.
Right. And strong anti-imperialist sentiments, particularly centered around Sankara's vision, economic independence, breaking ties with former colonial powers.
And studying geology where foreign companies dominate mining.
Yeah, the sources argue this almost certainly heightened his awareness of potential economic exploitation, which seems to have really shaped his later policies.
Then a really significant pivot in 2009. He joins the military, training at the Georges Namano Military Academy in Po.
This was a very clear shift, yeah. From academia to a military career. The sources suggest it was likely driven by a desire for discipline, a commitment to service, maybe a growing conviction that the military was the only way to tackle the country's deep-seated problems, especially with the security threat starting to brew.
And the training at Po is famously tough.
Notoriously rigorous, yeah. Focuses on physical endurance, strategic thinking, loyalty. The sources highlight how this probably reinforced his already noted discipline and really honed the skills needed for high-pressure situations, like planning complex operations or, leading a coup.
In military academies, they often instill strong nationalist ideals, don't they?
Absolutely. Especially in Burkina Faso, with Sankara's history as a military officer championing national pride and duty. The sources agree this training likely deepened Traoré's commitment to national sovereignty.
Right.
And the bonds formed there with fellow cadets, officers, those were also crucial. It fostered his ability to build alliances, inspire loyalty, which was absolutely key in those 2022 coups.
After Po, he gets specialized anti-aircraft training in Morocco.
This further boosted his technical expertise, demands precision, strategic thinking skills he'd applied directly in counterterrorism later. But the sources also point out it broadened his worldview, exposed him to a different political, cultural context, and importantly, Morocco's own complex relationships with Western powers.
So more exposure to international dynamics, maybe reinforcing that skepticism of foreign influence we talked about earlier.
Precisely. The sources argue witnessing those international military partnerships firsthand, seeing potential limitations or maybe perceived unequal terms, it just reinforced that skepticism.
Yeah.
And comparing Morocco's relative stability to the growing instability back home in Burkina Faso, that might have really solidified his determination to find bold, maybe even unconventional solutions.
Okay, looking back at this whole foundational period, from Kara through his training, how do your sources kind of synthesize these varied experiences? How did they shape the leader he eventually became?
Well, what the sources consistently highlight is this blend of formative forces, right? You see the resilience, the discipline forged in that rural life and then hammered home by military training. An anti-imperialist ideology, it seems to take root and grow, influenced by witnessing poverty, economic dependence firsthand, seeing urban political dissent, the specifics of geology and resource exploitation, and then observing international military dynamics.
Right.
Nationalism and Pan-Africanism, they're woven through his upbringing, his urban education, especially that Sankara legacy, and his military training. Strategic thinking, Leadership skills, those are developed through both his geology studies and the tough military training, and a really sharp awareness of economic exploitation, particularly around resources like gold, that seems to stem directly from his geology background and the economic realities he saw.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like a foundation built on both academic insight and these harsh realities he grew up with, and then it's all molded by that military structure.
Yeah. Let's move into, well, the crucible of his military career itself from about 2009 to 2022. Your sources show this whole period was just completely shaped by the escalating jihadist insurgency.
Yeah, this phase was truly defining, and the sources are crystal clear that it solidified his frustration with the existing political and military establishment.
He started with that training at Po and in Morocco, which gave him the technical skills and leadership foundation we just discussed. Yep. Grounded him in discipline, technical ability, and those nationalist ideals, partly inspired by Sankara.
Then came the years in counterterrorism operations. Your sources really highlight this as the period that kind of put him on the path to leadership, didn't they?
It was incredibly intense. He served right on the front lines against major groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates operating across the Sahel. The sources describe these campaigns as just brutal, high stakes. His direct experiences out there fighting these well-armed mobile insurgents, they directly shaped his views on what was needed from military leadership and what the country's real challenges were.
He even served in the UN mission in Mali, MINUSMA, back in 2018.
That's right, based in Timbuktu. The sources mention he actually earned recognition for his courage during attacks on the UN base there. And this experience, it exposed him to the complexities and, maybe more importantly from his perspective, the perceived limitations of international interventions and peacekeeping missions. That includes those involving France, like Operation Barkhane operating nearby.
Back in Burkina Faso, he participated in the Otaponu offensive in 2019.
Yeah, this was a major operation aimed at reclaiming territory from insurgents. But the sources indicate it faced pretty significant challenges, reports of limited resources, poor coordination between units. His role put him right in the middle of these high-risk operations, and critically, it seemed to deepen his frustration with what he and many of his peers saw as just inadequate support from the government and the military high command.
And the sources mention his experiences in the battles around Juba, that northern town repeatedly besieged by insurgents.
Right. Intense fighting, terrible civilian suffering, the military constantly struggling against this relentless enemy. Experiences like that on the front lines, seeing the toll on soldiers, on civilians, it would have powerfully fueled his conviction that radical, swift change was absolutely necessary to save the country from collapsing.
Because by 2022, the situation was truly dire. Your sources cite that the insurgency had displaced over 10% of the population, that's like 1.5 million people by January 2022, and killed thousands.
Exactly. The sources consistently paint this picture of a military that felt underfunded, poorly equipped, and relying on support from partners, particularly France and the U.S., that many, including Traoré it seems, saw as ineffective, slow, and maybe carrying neo-colonial strings attached. This context, this profound military frustration, it's absolutely critical to understanding the coups that followed.
By March 2022, the sources place him leading an artillery regiment in Kaya, that's a strategic northern town, heavily affected by attacks.
Yeah, this was a significant appointment. It put him right at the forefront of the crisis in a key location, and, crucially, it gave him significant influence and standing among other junior officers who felt, well, similarly frustrated. Leading a regiment in that kind of high-threat environment required serious strategic leadership, managing morale under constant pressure. It really solidified his position as a respected, capable commander among his peers.
Your sources mention some conflicting information about his direct involvement with the Cobra Special Forces Unit. Yeah. But they are consistent in reiterating his deep and significant role in counterterrorism efforts during this whole period.
Right. Whether he was formally part of that specific unit or not, his extensive time on the front lines fighting the insurgency is clearly documented in your material. And that's what earned him the credibility, the respect, and the influence among his fellow officers who were feeling the same way.
So how does his military career, these years, really forged in conflict, synthesize into the leader he becomes? What are the key takeaways from this period, according to your sources?
Well, the sources show this was the crucible, you know? It forged his tactical and strategic expertise, hardened by training and just real-world operations. It reinforced his anti-imperialist ideology, born from that frustration with the perceived failures and conditions of foreign counterterrorism help. He built deep bonds of camaraderie, honed leadership skills essential for mobilizing support quickly. His direct experience with inadequate resources perceived political indifference, bureaucratic failures. It all fueled his deep frustration with the existing governance structures.
Right.
And his exposure to the harsh realities of the Sahel conflict dynamics, the shared struggles with neighboring countries that solidified his nationalist and Pan-Africanist vision. It just all points back to the battlefield experience.
This brings us directly to the pivotal moment, his rise to power in 2022. The stage is set by the utter turmoil we just described.
Absolutely. With insurgents controlling nearly 40% of the country by late 2022, that staggering number of displaced people, there was just an immense power vacuum and widespread frustration. This was particularly acute among the junior officers, like Traoré, who felt they were doing the fighting but weren't getting the resources or the political backing needed to actually win. The sources show he emerged as a key leader among this frustrated group. And it's important to remember, this was happening amidst a regional trend of military takeovers in Mali and Niger next door, creating this sort of sense of momentum, maybe shared purpose.
He wasn't the leader of the military junta initially, though. Your sources mention he supported the January 2022 coup that ousted the civilian president Traoré.
Correct. That first coup, led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, was largely motivated by the military's deep frustration with Traoré's perceived failure to effectively tackle the escalating insurgency. The sources placed Traoré squarely within that cohort of junior officers who felt neglected by the civilian government and saw military rule as maybe the only viable solution at that point.
And that initial January coup's stated aims, prioritizing security, reducing foreign dependence, they seem to align pretty well with Traoré's emerging views, echoing those Sankara ideals.
They did. That first coup gave him first-hand experience in regime change, how it works, the challenges of actually taking power. But the sources also reveal it exposed him to the difficulties of junta governance, especially when Damiba himself seemed unable to curb the insurgency effectively and, in Traoré's view perhaps, lost that initial revolutionary focus and continued to rely heavily on France.
Right.
The sources are clear that Damiba's perceived failures directly set the stage for Traoré's own takeover just months later.
Which brings us to September 30th, 2022. Traoré leads the second coup, ousting Damiba. He declares himself interim president at just 34 years old.
Make him Africa's youngest head of state at the time, yeah. The sources detail the motivations behind this second coup. Profound dissatisfaction within the military. With Damiba's worsening security failures, the insurgency hadn't improved. It arguably got worse. An ideological divergence, the sources suggest Traoré felt Damiba's personal ambitions had diverged from the initial goals, and his continued perceived reliance on France was a major sticking point. And there was renewed frustration among junior officers who felt marginalized or ignored by Damiba's leadership.
In the execution of the coup, as described in your sources, it sounds like it drew heavily on his military background and skills.
Oh, yeah. It was swift, well-coordinated, seizing key installations, minimal resistance. The sources imply his tactical expertise, maybe honed in artillery command and counterterrorism, was crucial in planning and executing such a rapid takeover.
His public appeal during the coup was really striking, wasn't it? That televised address, positioning himself as this revolutionary leader, invoking Sankara, promising sovereignty, dignity.
Yes, the sources highlight this as a key moment in shaping his public image. The deliberate choices, those fist bump greetings with soldiers wearing the fatigues, the direct, often fiery rhetoric, it resonated powerfully with a population just utterly frustrated by insecurity, poverty, and this long history of foreign influence. He masterfully tapped into that deep well of discontent and anti-establishment feeling.
So the September coup really catapulted him onto the national and regional stage.
It really did. His youth, his evident charisma, and his powerful anti-imperialist message instantly made him this potent symbol for many. However, the sources also immediately raise questions about his lack of political experience and the inherent challenges, the risks of relying so heavily on military allies to actually govern.
Right.
And this moment, it critically shaped his subsequent decisions, like expelling French forces and aggressively pivoting Burkina Faso's international alliances.
Let's look at that consolidation of power right after. He was sworn in on October 6, 2022.
He moved quickly, appointed a transitional government, a mix of military officers and some civilians, though the military held the key spots. But as the sources point out, his most defining moves in this consolidation period were those bold, anti-imperialist policies.
Expelling French forces in February 2023 was a huge move, and popular domestically. according to your sources.
Absolutely. The sources describe it as a move that significantly cemented his image as a decisive leader, a defender of national sovereignty. He publicly declared the need for new, truly win-win relations with international partners.
And he immediately started pivoting alliances.
Yeah, notably towards Russia, and the sources point out this included engaging Russian mercenaries, often cited as being used more for regime protection than purely frontline combat.
Okay, that's a key distinction.
As well as turning towards Turkey and Iran. This clearly aligns with his stated vision of diversifying partnerships away from traditional Western powers.
And he's clearly cultivated a very specific public image during this time, too.
Very deliberately. A charismatic Sankara-like persona is really evident. He uses social media public appearances strategically to connect, especially with younger people. Your sources specifically mention rallies in Ouagadougou, like one cited on April 30th, 2025, where crowds were chanting his praise. And this gets amplified online, reportedly even with AI-generated content like deepfake videos and posts on platforms like X, comparing him explicitly to Sankara.
But alongside that public image stuff, your sources also detail some pretty concerning authoritarian measures.
Yes, the sources are clear on this. There have been crackdowns on dissent targeting journalists, civil society activists, even judges. Forced conscription has been introduced into the VDH, that's the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, a civilian militia.
Right.
Your sources also cite his responses to alleged coup attempts, like those reported in January 2023 and April 2025, which led to arrests and purges. This highlights the underlying instability, sure, but also his clear willingness to suppress opposition and consolidate power through force.
And all of this is happening while the security situation is actually getting worse. Your sources cite alarming numbers like, over 3,000 violent events and over 6,000 fatalities in 2024 alone?
Precisely. The insurgency continues to control significant territory. While he's dramatically increased military spending, critics cited in your sources argue his focus, including the use of those Russian mercenaries, seems to prioritize regime security in the capital over actually getting resources to the front lines to fight the insurgents. And the humanitarian crisis, it just continues to deepen. His alignment with Russia and forming the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, with Mali and Niger, it reflects this regional shift away from traditional partners, but it also underscores the massive challenges of governing a nation under such immense pressure.
So how does this rapid rise to power, these intense first months, how does it synthesize to shape the leader we see today? What does your material suggest?
Well, the sources show it really solidified his strategic acumen. I mean, he proved capable of orchestrating coups and rapidly forging new alliances. It reinforced that deeply held anti-imperialist and pan-Africanist ideology, which now drives his foreign policy. He successfully developed and leveraged that charisma and public appeal, particularly by invoking Sankara. But the sources also show this period solidified a military mindset that prioritizes control and a willingness to employ authoritarian tactics to achieve it. His response to the ongoing crisis is definitely shaped by his battlefield experience, but it's also criticized, as we said, for prioritizing regime security.
Let's delve deeper into that leadership style and his policies since September 2022 then. They seem very clearly defined by that anti-imperialist vision, a strong military approach, and that deliberate emulation of Sankara.
Yeah, that's a solid framework based on the sources. His leadership style, it's this blend of charismatic appeal, a very military-driven approach, and frankly, some concerning authoritarian tendencies, as highlighted in your material.
Tell us more about that charisma. The sources seem to really emphasize it.
It's that deliberate Sankara-like quality, The military fatigues, the direct, often fiery rhetoric delivered with those signature fist bumps. It genuinely seems to resonate with a large chunk of the population, particularly the youth and those with strong Pan-Africanist sympathies.
Right.
The sources show how this image is carefully cultivated through rallies, like that April 30th, 2025 event, and amplified heavily on social media, including, the reported use of AI-generated content to reinforce comparisons to Sankara and build this larger-than-life persona.
And the military mindset, how does that actually manifest in his leadership day to day?
Well, it's pretty evident from his background in training and counterterrorism. The sources suggest he prioritizes centralized control, swift action, and security above pretty much all other considerations. You see it in his reliance on loyal officers, the introduction of forced conscription into that VDH militia, and a preference for rapid, top-down decisions.
Which seems intrinsically linked to those authoritarian tendencies your sources highlight.
Absolutely. The sources detail crackdowns on anyone perceived as a threat. Journalists, civil society, judges sometimes through arbitrary detention, like that journalist arrested in 2023 for questioning security policies. The forced conscription raises significant human rights concerns, putting untrained civilians into really dangerous roles.
Yeah.
His responses to alleged coup attempts in 2023 and 2025, involving purges and repression, further illustrate a willingness to use heavy-handed tactics to maintain control. While maybe aimed at regime stability, the sources argue it raises serious questions about democratic freedoms.
And this leadership is unfolding in that persistent crisis environment, right?
Right.
Over 2 million displaced. Those incredibly high fatality numbers from 2024.
It is, and there's a genuine public demand for a strong leader, someone capable of solving the security crisis. His military background, his anti-imperialist stance, it taps into that desire for decisive action and national pride. But the sources suggest his authoritarian measures are polarizing. While many see him as a necessary strongman or even a revolutionary hero, others view him with alarm as an autocrat suppressing basic freedoms. And those repressive tactics, they risk eroding the very public support he needs to govern effectively.
Okay, let's look at the key policies themselves. First, security. Combating that relentless insurgency. That was the main promise.
It was his core promise for taking power, yes. The sources show he dramatically increased military spending by 70%, up to nearly $1 billion by 2024. He expanded the VDH militia and introduced forced conscription, aiming for this kind of grassroots defense. But as the sources point out, this program is widely criticized for its human rights implications and for sending untrained civilians into combat zones. And he has intensified counterterrorism operations.
But the outcome, according to your sources, well, it's difficult to see it as positive so far.
Yeah, it really is. The sources indicate the violence actually escalated significantly in 2024, a 20% increase in violent events, with fatalities nearly doubling compared to 2022. Insurgents still control significant territory.
Wow.
Critics cited in your material argue that resources, including the controversial use of those Russian mercenaries, seem focused on regime security in the capital rather than effectively equipping and supporting the frontline troops actually fighting the insurgency. And the humanitarian crisis, rather than improving, just continues to worsen.
Okay, next, his push for economic self-sufficiency, particularly leveraging resources like gold. This links back to his geology studies you mentioned.
It's a significant focus, and yes, the sources clearly link it to his geology background and that awareness of resource wealth. He approved the construction of Burkina Faso's first gold refinery in November 2023, with these ambitious targets of processing 400 kilograms daily. The goal is job creation, keeping revenue in the country, reducing reliance on foreign processing. And in February 2024, he suspended gold export permits for small-scale production, aiming to combat smuggling and boost state revenue.
But your sources suggest that caused some disruption.
It definitely has. While the intention might have been more state control, the sources report it significantly disrupted artisanal miners, a major source of livelihood for many, and led to protests. Major agricultural initiatives are promoted, but their implementation is severely hampered by the ongoing insurgency, which just makes vast areas unsafe for farming. And the benefits of that gold refinery project, they're also not yet really being felt on the ground.
His international realignment is maybe the most visible policy shift, at least globally.
Oh, absolutely. It's a direct result of that anti-imperialism forged during his military career and education, especially his frustration with perceived ineffective and neo-colonial partnerships. The expulsion of French forces in February 2023 was the most symbolic act widely popular domestically. He cited ineffective support, neo-colonial interference. He declared the need for genuinely reciprocal win-win relationships.
And he pivoted alliances pretty swiftly after that.
Yeah, towards Russia, Turkey, and Iran, seeking military and economic support. He engaged with Russia, including the use of those mercenaries we mentioned. He co-founded the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, with Mali and Niger, a regional security pact, even proposing a federation eventually, aimed at reducing dependence on traditional bodies like ECOWAS or the G5 Sahel, which he sees as having failed the region.
These bold policies, while reflecting his ideology, have clearly led to significant controversies and challenges, as your sources detail.
Undeniably. The authoritarianism is a major area of concern. Those crackdowns, forced conscription, repression following alleged coup attempts. The sources highlight growing concerns about democratic backsliding, basic human rights.
And the security failures are stark, especially given that this was his primary justification for taking power in the first place.
They really are. The worsening insurgency, despite all the spending, the perception that regime security is prioritized over frontline needs, the persistent humanitarian crisis, this directly undermines his revolutionary image and his legitimacy in the eyes of many.
Economic disruptions add another layer of challenge, too.
That's right. The gold export restrictions hurting vulnerable artisanal miners, delays in promised economic projects like the refinery, agriculture struggling because of insecurity, these cause tangible hardship and discontent on the ground, potentially eroding the support his image has garnered.
And internationally, there's that risk of isolation or maybe over-reliance on less reliable partners.
Definitely. Reduced Western aid and investment following the expulsion of France. Reliance on partners like Russia brings its own set of complexities and potential instability, and the AES itself faces significant internal and external challenges.
So looking at this leadership and these policies, how do your sources show they reflect those formative experiences we discussed earlier? It seems really interconnected.
It's all interconnected, exactly as the sources reveal. His rural roots in geology studies directly inform that intense focus on economic self-sufficiency, leveraging national resources like gold, although implementing those policies can cause disruptions for the very communities he aims to help.
Right.
His military background clearly drives that aggressive security posture, the preference for control, the use of authoritarian measures like the VDH, and prioritizing regime security. The anti-imperialism forged in his education and military career dictates those dramatic foreign policy shifts. His developing charisma and communication style, noted since high school and amplified through social media, are central to cultivating that Sankara image and maintaining public support through rhetoric. And his strategic opportunism is evident in the rapid implementation of reforms and forming new alliances in response to the crisis.
That connection between his background and his actions as leader is really clear from the sources. Let's talk about his public image and the controversies that surround him, because your material shows he is a deeply polarizing figure.
Oh, he absolutely is. On one hand, he's carefully cultivated this powerful public image, the Sankara-inspired revolutionary leader.
Building on that combination of being quiet but talented in his youth, evolving into someone who seems approachable yet commanding.
Yes, and he's become this potent anti-imperialist symbol, expelling French forces, pivoting to non-Western powers, the rhetoric against neocolonialism demanding win-win partnerships. The sources show all of this feeds directly into that image. You hear the crowds at rallies, like that one cited on April 30th, 2025, chanting, "Traoré is our Sankara." And that image is amplified across social media, reportedly even with AI-generated content and posts comparing him directly to Sankara. His youth also gives him significant appeal, especially with younger generations who see him as a dynamic alternative to older leaders.
This image really resonates, as your sources point out, given the widespread disillusionment with previous governments and their failure to stop the insurgency.
Precisely. 2 million displaced, those incredibly high fatality numbers in 2024. There was this deep yearning for a leader who seemed willing to take radical action. And his anti-imperialist stance aligns perfectly with a growing regional sentiment across the Sahel.
And what's the impact of this powerful image, according to your sources?
Well, it successfully consolidated support and elevated his status nationally and regionally. But the sources also caution that it relies heavily on rhetoric and symbolism, which raises expectations for tangible results. His policies, particularly on security, may be struggling to actually meet.
Which brings us squarely to the controversies. Your sources suggest these directly contradict or at least complicate parts of that revolutionary image.
They absolutely do. The authoritarian measures are a major source of controversy. The sources detail crackdowns on dissent, suppression of media freedom, including that journalist detention we mentioned, forced conscription into the VDH, which raises serious human rights concerns, and the repressive response to alleged coup attempts. This is linked back to that military mindset and can fuel perceptions of paranoia, a willingness to use force against perceived enemies, not just insurgents.
Then there are the security failures, perhaps the most damaging controversy for a leader who promised to fix the insurgency above all else.
Yeah, the sources are clear. The insurgency is worsening, not improving, despite increased spending and bold rhetoric. Critics, as cited in your material, point to the use of Russian mercenaries for personal security as evidence that regime protection in the capital might be prioritized over effectively supporting the troops on the front lines. The ongoing humanitarian crisis persists. This directly undermines his core promise and severely tarnishes that revolutionary image for some.
Economic disruptions add another layer of challenge and controversy, too.
The sources describe the gold export restrictions hurting artisanal miners and sparking protests, delays in promised projects like the refinery, ongoing agricultural challenges due to insecurity. These cause real hardship for ordinary citizens and can erode the support his image has garnered.
And finally, that international isolation you touched on earlier.
Reduced Western aid and support after expelling France, the practical challenges of relying on potentially less reliable partners like Russia, the internal and external hurdles facing the AES, this foreign policy, while maybe bolstering his anti-imperialist image, creates significant practical challenges for a country already in crisis.
How do your sources suggest these controversies reflect his formative experiences? It feels like a feedback loop.
His rural roots contribute to that nationalist appeal and focus on economic issues. But implementing policies like the gold restrictions, while maybe well-intentioned to retain wealth, can cause disruptions for those very rural communities he came from. His military background is strongly linked to the authoritarianism and the focus on regime security, which fuels concerns about human rights and democratic freedoms.
Right.
The anti-imperialism, while driving foreign policy shifts, leads to international controversies and potential isolation. His charisma and communication style, while effective in building his image, can create a reliance on rhetoric that isn't always matched by results on the ground. And ultimately, his inability so far to curb the insurgency despite his military background is the biggest challenge and directly undermines that carefully cultivated image.
It feels like a constant tension, doesn't it, between the revolutionary ideals he projects and the harsh realities of governing a country under siege.
It absolutely is. And his image, his controversies, they're part of a broader trend we're seeing in the Sahel region, where military juntas are navigating similar paths, often emulating figures like Sankara to build legitimacy, but facing the same immense, persistent challenges of security, governance, and economic development.
Switching gears slightly, your sources mention very little about his personal life. It seems like a very deliberate choice.
It really does. The public information available is extremely limited. The sources suggest this aligns with a kind of military discipline, a focus on duty above personal exposure. It helps him avoid distractions, protects vulnerabilities like his family, and cultivates an image of being solely dedicated to the nation's cause.
And it feeds into that enigmatic, almost mysterious image he projects. Makes him seem focused, maybe selfless.
Exactly. It makes him seem selfless, focused entirely on the mission, much like Sankara, who also maintained a relatively ascetic, duty-focused public persona. The sources also mention the cultural context in Burkina Faso, where protecting family by keeping them out of the political spotlight is pretty common practice.
What little is known about his personal life, based on your sources?
Well, we know he is Muslim, which is the majority faith in Burkina Faso. And the sources suggest this likely shapes his sense of discipline and community values. He speaks French, the official language from his education, which enables his public addresses and international diplomacy, like meeting leaders such as Putin. Your sources also mention he is apparently an avid football player soccer. It's a hugely popular sport, so that can help create a sense of relatability, especially with the youth, and suggest physical vitality.
And regarding family or marital status? Anything.
As you noted, nothing public. The sources point out this is pretty unusual for a head of state globally, but it's consistent with his extremely private nature and military focus. Unlike Sankara, who was publicly married, Traoré's lack of public family information just reinforces that enigmatic image and might well be a conscious security measure.
He doesn't seem to travel internationally very much either, does he?
Very rarely, according to your sources. The only known trip outside the Alliance of Sahel States region since taking power was apparently to Ghana for President Mahama's inauguration in January 2025.
Interesting.
The sources interpret this as suggesting a cautious approach to travel, prioritizing regional engagements and select non-Western partners who align with his new foreign policy. This limited global presence contrasts somewhat with Sankara's international visibility, but it aligns with a military leader focused intensely on the domestic crisis and security.
How do your sources suggest this privacy, this limited personal exposure, shapes his leadership style and public perception?
Well, that underlying discipline and focus stemming from his private nature and military training, the sources argue, they manifest in his rapid responses to events, policies like conscription, and an unwavering focus on perceived duty. His relatability and cultural connection come through those few known details. His faith, his hobby helping to humanize or soften his image for supporters. His guarded life and military background are linked to his intense focus on security. Not just national security, but protecting his own vulnerabilities. This includes the controversial use of Russian mercenaries for personal security. And finally, the sources show his minimal personal exposure mirrors aspects of Sankara's approach, which is crucial to reinforcing that revolutionary image.
But even this privacy ties into controversies, doesn't it?
It does, as your sources highlight. That lack of personal details can be perceived as aloofness, maybe secrecy. It limits transparency, makes him seem distant from the everyday struggles of the population, especially when the country is facing such immense challenges.
And that focus on personal security, particularly with the mercenaries, that raises eyebrows.
Yeah, the sources report critics argue his reliance on Russian mercenaries, specifically for his own protection, suggests he's prioritizing his personal safety or regime security over the needs of the soldiers fighting and dying on the front lines against the insurgency. While maybe understandable given the alleged coup attempts, it can undermine his carefully constructed public image as a selfless leader solely dedicated to the national cause.
And the lack of a public family narrative. Does that matter?
Well, it makes him seem like a solitary figure. While maybe intended for protection, the sources suggest it can limit public empathy and potentially reinforce perceptions of him being an inaccessible, maybe even authoritarian figure.
So his private life, or the deliberate lack of it in the public sphere, it enhances the mystique and the revolutionary image on one level, but your sources show it also fuels controversy by limiting that human connection, that relatability that a leader arguably needs to unite a nation in crisis.
Exactly. It's clearly a strategic choice, rooted in his background and his goals, but the sources show it comes with significant risks in terms of fostering public trust and deep relatability beyond just the symbolic level.
We've taken a really deep dive into the sources you provided, tracing Ibrahim Traoré's journey, haven't we? From a quiet student in a rural village, interested in geology, through his years as a military captain fighting a brutal insurgency, and finally to his position as Africa's youngest president.
Yeah, we've seen how forces like his humble roots, his exposure to inequality and the complexities of foreign influence, the rigorous military discipline he embraced, his disillusionment with previous governance failures, and of course the enduring legacy of Thomas Sankara have profoundly shaped him into the figure he is today, according to your material.
And we've explored the core tensions highlighted in your sources about his leadership. Those bold, revolutionary ideals clashing with the complex, often brutal realities of pragmatic governance in a crisis. His fierce anti-imperialism, potentially leading to international isolation, and his military-driven approach struggling, so far, to deliver a decisive victory against a deeply entrenched insurgency, despite pouring resources into it.
So you've now got a pretty comprehensive overview based on the material you provided. It offers significant insights into this really fascinating and, controversial figure at the heart of a critical moment for Burkina Faso.
And that leaves us with a provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as you continue to follow events in Burkina Faso, drawing on everything we've unpacked from your sources. Given these insights we've gained about a leader forged in conflict, defined by both charisma and a strategic reliance on privacy and control, can he truly unite a fractured nation under siege? And does his deliberate emulation of Thomas Sankara offer a viable path towards hope and stability for Burkina Faso, or does it actually risk repeating the perils and challenges of the past? Something to think about as you process these findings further.